Hello and welcome to Alan's latest webinar. Thanks everyone who's joining us either Zoom or on Facebook. The topic of today's webinar is around clinical trials, how to improve their relevance to patients and how you can review trial protocols. I'm delighted to be joined by Bettina Ryle, who is chair of the Melanoma Patients Network Europe. She's on the Cancer Mission Board. She's been an amazing active advocate for science and many other areas as part of organisations like WeCan, and there's so many other things to list. I probably won't start, or it'll take most of the webinar. Really looking forward to her presentation on clinical trials. Lots of exciting information and lots of learnings to be taken as to how to make the best use of science in clinical trials as a patient advocate. So over to you, Bettina. Looking forward to it.
Thanks so much for that. I know we're just very few today, so I suggest that if there are any questions, you just stop me and we directly take it. And actually what I would like to walk you through in the next, I don't know, half an hour, or depending a little bit how many questions you got, is a little bit how I think about whether we as patients or whether as patient advocates should get involved in research, and not just clinical trials, but even broader. Because, I mean, as you know, clinical trials are just the drugs getting tested in patients, but first you have to have something to test in patients. And that's why I quite like this 96 well plate here on the screen. So the perspective today is a little bit broader than just clinical trials, but of course we get to clinical trials. Now, I've been thinking a little bit about patient involvement in research for the last, for a long time, but a bit more focused in the last half year or so. And I think you might not know me, Rita. By background, I'm a medic. So I've studied medicine in Germany and in France, and I have a PhD in biomedical sciences from University College London. And I worked a couple of years in in developmental biology on branchial arch patterning, and then in heterogeneity, more from the cancer is, of course, more the reverse. How do we solve heterogeneity? And I moved to Sweden to work in research for a couple of years, and lost my husband to melanoma in 2012, after which I founded MPNE, the Melanoma Patient Network Europe, and got into advocacy. And because of my background in between medicine and research, I think I've always been more or most interested at this interface for how can we get research more meaningful for patients, and what can we from our side do to push that process. And what I would like to show you now in the next 30 minutes or so is really how I think about the process and how I think about the concepts behind it. Because what I have seen a lot recently is that people are very keen on becoming involved, but it has something of being involved to be involved, not why one should be sitting there. So I have quite a bit on my thoughts on the concepts behind it in order to choose where to get involved and how to make sure it's the right spot and how to have maximum impact for what you want to achieve. So this is a diagram I've obviously ripped off the internet. It's from a quite read-worthy blog, so the link is below. It is drawn after a book, Start With Why by Cynic, which I think is quite lengthy to read. There's a lot of repetition, but the basic concept, which is summarized in this drawing, is quite helpful. That's why I'm using it. So it is starting with why should we bother? Then how do we think about it and how do we go about it? And then what do we concretely have to do? And my presentation is roughly following that structure. So why, as patient advocate, should we be getting involved in research? For me, there are two main reasons. So one of them is accountability. And the other one would be better research. Starting with A, let's start with accountability. Research is actually funded with public money at large parts, at least academic research. You can say that pharmaceutical research isn't, but academic research is funded by taxpayer money, so our money. So there is some kind of accountability of the researcher towards society, and in particular towards patients, because the research in a medical setting is conducted on patient samples, on patients' data, and often on patients' time if you look at a clinical trial. So patients are directly affected by the research, and it is often also claimed that the research conducted is conducted in patients' interest or to address an unmet need of patients. Now, if they've never bothered even checking that that is true, they fail in the accountability bracket, if you want. that to me is a type of pull thinking. The researchers are asked to deliver it, and we can ask them to deliver, we can request the delivery, and it happens after the fact. So the research comes to an end, and we're asking where are the publications, where are the lay abstracts. So that happens once the research has been conducted. On the other side, there's something for us, I think, as motivation to get involved, namely that we want better research. So how do I define better research? And there are lots of different aspects in it, and we don't have time to go into detail. So that would be discussion maybe for another time. But the first one would be the research has to start with a relevant question. And that's not quite as obvious as it sounds, because lots of things sound, it would be good to know, but in reality misses the point of what is truly relevant to patients. Then there's something about the way how the research is conducted, and that's something that is often missed in our community, because people believe that if they have been involved in priority setting, they have fixed the main problem. However, the choice of model systems and how a research consortium, for example, is set up greatly influences the quality of the result and the impact that it can have. For those of you who have already been in research consortia and in MPNE, we are now on our third Horizon 2020 project. I can tell you, and I mean, I've been involved in research project as a researcher in my previous life. There is something that I call the hit and run type of research. People take the allocated budget and then do what they've always been done with minimal interaction with the other partners in the consortium. And then just for reports, everyone presents to be part of the same gang. That sounds, of course, now very cynical, but often it comes down to the fact that there is no one who's responsible for stitching the parts together. And every researcher, I mean, no one wants to impinge on someone else's work or step onto someone else's territory. So everyone just like holds at the short of the border to the next project, but there is no transition in short. And as long as there is no one responsible for that transition, we shouldn't be surprised that in the end we end up with like a carpet of little pieces, but no consistent lined up piece of research. And then of course it's not just enough to conduct research, you have to do something with the findings. So it's about how do we get research findings into the patient in the end. And so that means along an entire translational chain of basic research, clinical trials, and then of course if it is a drug, through drug approval, HTA, and then into clinical usage, which is a very, very different problem. Lots of times researchers are not aware of the end tail of the end of the tail of the dog, if you want. So they're very much focused on their early part. And it does not help that research has like a thick incentive system. So researchers are incentivized by publications, not whether the drug reaches a patient. So there's a lot of work in that space that I think is largely ignored by our community, where I think we have a real chance to drive research that delivers more meaningful results for our patients. That I consider there's a specific case, and I'm going to briefly allude to that. In the case of clinical trials, fairer design on patients is an additional factor, because clinical trials are treatment options for patients, and therefore that's for us as another motivation to become involved at that step. I think of it as the push involvement in research. We want to be proactive, we want to define what's happening, and that means we're there before the fact happens, as opposed to after the fact pull type of advocacy. Now, if we go towards the accountability side of things, going back now, this I consider as part of the obligations of a researcher. Just as we expect a researcher not to cheat, how to have appropriate controls for their experiments, I believe it is part of their obligations to make their research accessible, and that increasingly also includes accessible to a lay audience. From my perspective, that's not something we should be doing for them. That's part of their obligation, something what they get paid for, and we are there to request that it happens. I, however, believe it is not our job to write lay abstracts for others. So that, for me, is the pull side of things. Often this has a shape that patients or the general public, depending a little bit on the country, are involved in committees of any type, sometimes funding committees, sometimes trial steering committees, but without a clearly allocated function. So it's something like the eye of the public watching over the project, which is a form of accountability and transparency. And then I already mentioned the outreach so the coverage of the research, which could be summaries, but also participation in science days or presenting in schools, or any type of interaction between the researcher and the wider and the wider either patient community or society. That would be another case of pull advocacy in the research setting. This is Transperimet, whom you might be familiar with this organization. So there's the link on the bottom. Basically, what they are, or the people behind there, are very, very keen on getting all clinical trial results reported in order to make sure that all evidence that was generated is available to the wider public to avoid distortion in medicine, for example, because if we've seen this, and Ben Goldecker has published on that, because negative trial results are less likely to be published, so you only get to see the positive ones, so you have a skewed view of what's truly going on. So what they're doing is they monitor the reporting of clinical trial results, and I just took some snapshot from their news page there. For example, they check country by country, so they checked in Germany, they checked in Italy, they recently also checked in Sweden. But they also, for example, support training how to better report, because it turned out that the process that is held at the EMA is far from easy. So one should be surprised that actually people struggle to report in time because the process is so tedious. So they have also advocated and have helped to simplify the registration process. There are now these like these training programs, web-based training programs that they support. And to the very right, you see that Transperimet has also advocated with a big one of the main research funders here in Sweden. And I just picked this up because it just was on the thread. So it's not because I live in Sweden, it was just because it was there on the thread, that they basically advocate on the side of the funders that funders stipulate in their funding conditions. They also contact national regulatory authorities, because those are the ones who should be pushing for the registration of trial results. So that's a kind of multi-level advocacy effort that puts emphasis on the accountability side of things. And we as advocates, of course, can engage with that organization. We can support them. We have worked with them. We use their work. We share their work. So that for us would be an activity on the pull side of things that is not directly linked to a specific project, but is larger. And that, of course, helps to shape the environment. And with that, hopefully helps us to get more accountability in that space. Now, and of course, I think that's not a surprise, for what I'm particularly passionate about is the research side. What I don't like about the accountability side is mainly the lack of speed. It happens after the fact. So by that time, you cannot improve anything more. The thing has happened. If something went wrong, we have lost time, we will have lost money, we will have lost patient samples in the process. So from our perspective, I think just relying on that is not good enough, and it's definitely not fast enough. So what can we do to actually do something proactively from the push side? So I believe that what we can do is we can put more emphasis on formulating what type of research we believe has to happen in our community. Or we can do that proactively, not just waiting to be asked, but just start thinking by ourselves, analyzing it. And I have some techniques later on how to do that. Then we should focus on, or we should sharpen and deepen our knowledge about how research is conducted. What type of model systems are relevant for our disease? What type of model systems are not relevant? How do you validate research results in a setting, in a clinical setting, to make sure that you can actually trust the let's say, cell culture findings? Then the process I already alluded to, translation, is a really, really tricky process. It is in our interest that research moves as fast and as smoothly along the pathway as humanly possible. Oddly enough, we have an overlapping interest with funding bodies there. So funding bodies, in a way, are our best friend to get into any type of research, be it a clinical trial or fundamental research project, because we share that interest. We want translation to be effective and fast, with minimal friction between the parts and no distraction by competing vested interests. So then obviously there is also the access to research question for patients. Clinical trials for us are treatment options. I've said this from the beginning. There are people who like to sell it as that we do clinical trials for research. I don't know about your disease. I'm coming from melanoma. When my husband was diagnosed in 2011, everyone died. So your only chance was trying something experimental. So in that setting, clinical trials weren't just there because it's so nice to do research. For us, it was a chance to survive. Anyone who is alive from that time has actually been on clinical trials. So from our perspective, access to research and clinical trials is increasing the chances of the people on there to survive. Also, and that's important to know, is that in many countries, especially university hospitals, a hospital with a research department use research funding to improve diagnostics in clinical care. For example, or what we talk so much about, like precision medicine, which is usually just a very limited concept focused on some testing. That happens in centers because they use research funds to pay for it. This is something you will not get in a peripheral hospital. Whether that is fair or not is one thing. At the other time, it is understanding what's out there in research can help us to get better diagnostics for patients. And we might not need it for every patient, but those patients who become resistant to therapies and need other options, for us, it's important to know who does what type of research and who could find new angles that we could exploit therapeutical. So from that perspective, access to that research is really, really important. And then I have already mentioned the trials as treatment options. Now, if you remember the circle, that was the why. The next step is, so how do we actually go about it? Talking is quite nice, but how should we think about that process to get the type of research that actually matters for us? I try to use a very high level, like a bracket, how I think about it. I believe what it takes above all is strategy. One needs a strategic approach, and the overview has to be larger than a single trial. It has to go at least one level up. We need to be constructive. The fastest way to solve a problem is to have a better solution to it. We can stand there and complain till forever, but it will not necessarily improve anything. The moment we can contribute to solutions, that's when we gain speed. And proactivity, I believe, is critical, because we should not forget that we are part of the research ecosystem, whether we like it or not. Our people join clinical trials, they donate time, samples, and that's why people come to us and come with this altruism story, patients are so great and donate. I mean, that's naive from our side. We should start to use it more strategically and make sure that if something is important, we have the resources lined up and can support what matters to us and make it conditional. It would be silly to hand over the control to something that is so relevant. And something that I think is ignored by most, because they even don't realize that, for example, outside COVID, we're now online, but usually our meetings are face-to-face. We all organize conferences where we invite multiple stakeholders. We can create environments where people meet. So by putting the right type of people into the room, you can make magic happen, because people get to meet in your surrounding. We have the advantage that we are not tied down by compliance like the pharmaceutical industry, for example. So in our surroundings, people are freer to voice their opinions. So by being strategic how you design your conference programs, whom you invite, make sure that they stay for dinner. That's a way how you have, in a way, less control, but you shape an environment that enables research, that gets people to meet in a setting you have created. If you have patients in that present, people have a very acute understanding of what the need in that situation is. And we actually, in my network, we've been able, and sometimes, it's surprising, you just think, oh, they should be talking. And we had several research projects that were initiated after people met at our meetings. So that's a space for us to use more deliberately and to spend more time, and obviously hope that we're going to be back to real meetings sometime very soon. So that was just a very high level one, because I thought I focus a little bit more on concrete ideas and to share some examples of what we are doing to see whether that's something that's applicable to you, that you think might work in your setting, that you can copy, share, adjust, whatever, or just ignore, depending on whether it's useful to you. But I wanted to share with you something that we are actually doing. So starting again with a very big picture. So I believe the first thing one we all have to do is have a very acute understanding of what I call a problem space. We all have our what I call favorite problems. We often look at our disease, we come from a personal perspective, and if you ask people, they will have their favorite problem. That's not the reality. In reality, our diseases have a multitude of issues. Different people have different problems. So I think of them as problem space, and I want to give you an example how to map that actually. Once you have an overview of all there is in terms of problems, you can then start strategizing and look at it and categorize, and then pick the places where you should be involved and choose those where you can really make a difference. You also want to find the places where if you spend time on them, nothing is going to move. They're really, really important because that's where you lose your time. So you're tied down by something that has no chance of ever improving the situation. And unless you have very, very good reasons to do it, that's something obviously to avoid. Then I think, and I don't have a good demonstration, I won't have a good slide for that, but I also think of solutions multidimensional. In a way, what I do is to take the 3 domains that I've just shown you, to have a strategy, to have solutions, and to be proactive, and overlay them with my problem space. And then I'm thinking about how we can put this together in something that is cohesive and consistent to drive the solutions that we need for our community. And I have examples for that as well. And then I call this upskill ruthlessly. In the end, we are as good as the knowledge we have in order to understand the system, the time, the solutions we can contribute, and how much input we can provide. We often get told that, oh, this is too difficult for patients, or why would a patient want to know that, which usually is about the right level, where you want to train for. If you want to be taken seriously in any conversation, and if your ambition is to shape research, not just to work on the accountability side, that's where you should be aiming for. And there is no permission that you're allowed to only learn this or that. So this upskilling part is essential, and in a way is kind of, without that, it will be very, very hard to truly move anything in research, because you won't have the necessary tools. So I'm not sure what happened here actually. Yeah, okay. So that's something that just sums up what I just said. To be or not to be, that is the question. And I think it's really, really important to understand that it is not about being involved to be involved. You can be sitting on 50 trials if you want. If you're not able, or if you're not in a position to move anything there, then it's as if you weren't sitting there. So it's not about being there to be there. It is there, you are there to move something for patients. And if you're not moving anything, then either you're doing it wrong or you're in the wrong position. And I think for us, it's really important to be very critical with ourselves. So usually what I do, I mean, now we're all sitting at home, you see, so this is my office. Usually when I've been somewhere on my way home, I'm always thinking whether this was worth my time, whether I've had any impact, whether it made any difference for patients. And if it didn't, I won't go there again. Sometimes it's very hard to see that, because sometimes the effect can be quite late. So I'm not always entirely sure, but still there are these concrete things where, you know, that was a total waste of time, and we have to be critical about ourselves. Another point on this is, whenever one gets invited, something that we tell our people, you should always be asking, why did they ask me? Did they ask me because I have a unique insight, expertise to help solve the solution? Or did they ask me because I do not have that expertise? If they just want me to sit there, that they can tick a box that a patient advocate was there, while I'm totally out of my depth in that specific area of expertise, I will not go. And that's something to be very mindful of, because we are very happy to be invited, and, you know, it's nice to be flattered, but in the end, we're not doing ourselves a favor if we accept things where we're not able to deliver at where we should be, if we have someone who would be better to sit there instead of us. So always ask yourself, I'm here because of my expertise, or am I here because of my lack of expertise in a specific area? Now, this is one of the first slides I ever made for patient advocacy, so it's ancient. There's even actually, I think, on the link, there's still, I think it was recorded at the time. So because of my background and because of my husband being on trials, this is how I started actually in patient advocacy. I looked at clinical trials and looked at where is the point where we should be involved, and where does it make most difference? Where does it create impact for patients, and where am I just wasting my time? So you see from the left side, you start with a problem. I'm not sure you can see my cursor, but you start with a clinical question or problem. Then you've kind of turn that problem into a scientific question and design a trial to answer that question. Then comes the practicalities like patient recruitments, and then comes the management and running of the trials. Things have slightly improved since I started, but at the time, usually pharma would show up to talk to us once their trials weren't recruiting. Or the little bit more advanced ones would coming to review informed consents. And I'm on record for not caring about informed consents. Let me explain. The impact on patients is to the left. If you design the question right and your design is fair, this has huge impact on patients. If you advertise a trial, first, you shouldn't be doing it if it is bad for patients. Or you can have the most beautiful informed consent. If the trial is rubbish, your most beautiful consent will have no impact whatsoever. Also, clinical trials have several serious issues. One of them being they're usually a phone book. You can say you need this because you need a legal context. In reality, what it does is it hides the essential information in plain sight. The information, the important bits in clinical trials is the interest of the patient on the trial, the single individual comes first. So if it is in the patient's best interest to do something or not to do something, that comes before anything. The second one is your right to withdraw from the trial without any fear of consequences. Of course, they don't want patients to drop out. So that's usually on page very far below, among lots of other texts which you will never properly read. That's one thing. Then, if this was a scientific document, you wouldn't pass your first scientific class at university ever, because you will be surprised that even for a phase 3 trial, there is never any prior evidence to be found. They pretend that this was a big unanswered question, but no one would start a phase 3 without prior evidence. And you can even look at ASCO and ESMO and read up what that was. So we are basically giving people to sign a phone book without telling them what we actually know already about the question. So you can tell them you want it in Arial or Times New Roman and you prefer it in pink, yellow, or blue, but it will make no difference. That does not mean that we shouldn't pay attention to these informed consents, but there has been fantastic work already done. There are official recommendations, so it's about using them. So if you, as a patient advocate, start reading them and spend a lot of time on something that will not change anything for that patient and still omits the crucial information that would actually make a difference for patients, that's up to you. Now, something to think about trials before I have a wash list of where things often go wrong in clinical trials, because you were promised some insights into clinical trials. I consider trials, there are two types of trials. One is a true research trial, something we don't know and want to find out. The other trials are what I call access trials. Many countries, for example, don't have a proper legislation how to deal with off-label usage of drugs. In order to get people on drugs that are not approved for that condition, what they do is they set up a clinical trial. Clinical trials are often also set up when the local HTAs, health technology assessment bodies, are slow. So you have a trial to bridge that gap in access. You will think about these totally differently. One is a serially scientific exercise that, of course, still has to have a design that is good for the patient on there. While the other one, you basically don't care about the scientific question because it wasn't about the science anyway. If they then in addition find out something that is halfway useful, that's a nice to have. But in the end, it's about getting people on drugs. So you should have that very clear in your mind, because I had people actually criticizing access trials for the lack of science. And then you go, well, they were never intended to be for science in the first place, but for patients, they're relevant because they're access. So that's a good start. Then, oh, something moved in my slides. I'm really sorry. Oh, that was not intended. So I'm sorry, everyone. What happened is that the last version of my slideshow apparently didn't copy across between computers. So let me find my other one and I will show you the other slides where I tell you where I've put down some thoughts actually about what I have observed in clinical research when looking through protocols, and I have been replaced. Yes, it's coming. What we have seen over years. So I've been looking at clinical trials first when I needed them for my husband. Then I have put comments onto patient forums and on Twitter. where you actually get a lot of attention, because of course pharma companies don't like it if all of a sudden someone tells publicly that their trial is not interesting or relevant for patients. And I am currently on a I am on a clinical trials steering committee for a melanoma trial. I've been teaching trial design at the MCCR workshop there, where young oncologists learn how to design clinical trials. So they get a week to write a full protocol, which is like brave. There I became a little bit too critical, so they replaced me by a more convenient advocacy colleague. But I've done it for 4 or 5 years, and I have quite a network of people from that time. I've been lecturing about patient-centered clinical trial design for a while here at Uppsala University in a master's program. So I have been thinking about that space for quite some time. Obviously, you have to understand that I'm in melanoma. So what I review are mainly melanoma protocols. So if things are not 100% applicable to your situation, that obviously then comes from the fact that this is my area of expertise, and this is a solid tumor, and it's not a hematological malignancy. So please see this with this lens. So what is frequently wrong, from my experience with clinical trials, is that the scientific motivation is weak. So of course, and that's why I mentioned it before, the access trials are a different category altogether. But there is a shocking number of clinical trials that is either wouldn't it be nice to know type of thinking, not very attractive. Then there are trials driven mainly by industries, just combining 2 drugs that they happen to have in their portfolio, where you think, really? I mean, you can get anything to work in the right type of cell line. So there's the scientific motivation is wrong. And on academic side, it would be what they are able to get in terms of drugs. So the trial design is not motivated by what would make sense scientifically, but what they were able to talk out of pharma companies usually, or out of the healthcare system. So it's more, what can we get and test instead of what would the best be? And that, of course, is not good for patients. Then classic bugbear are inclusion-exclusion criteria. I officially call them beautified patient population, or the Olympic patients. By cutting inclusion-exclusion criteria the right or wrong way, you can basically optimize your trial results by excluding anyone with diseases, like underlying diseases, comorbidities. That would be one. That's a frequent one. What we have seen is actually more sophisticated. You can, lines of prior treatment is also quite frequent, but you can, for example, and we have seen this in melanoma quite a lot, demand unrealistic time intervals between the end of the last treatment and the start of the trial. Or for when brain metastases are allowed, unrealistically long times for stable, by which you effectively exclude every patient in that bracket. So you theoretically allow them, but because your criteria, the small print, are so unrealistic, you effectively exclude them. So these things are particularly nasty. From a patient advocacy perspective, these things are dangerous because they hurt patients 3 times, at least 3 times. There's 3 times I can think of. First, these patients have no trials. When trials are treatment, that means no treatment for these patients. Then by the time a drug gets approved, we haven't studied the drugs in that specific setting, so there is simply no knowledge. When these patients then later on are treated with the treatment, we just have no idea. That happened with us in melanoma because brain metastasis was excluded. So we had no idea whether it would work on brain mets or not. It turned out it does work, but it was never tested systematically. It turns out the trial that did it apparently had forgotten to screen patients for brain mets and discovered later that they had brain mets, and then realized it worked, which in the end turned out as an advantage for the company. But we shouldn't be leaving things to chance like that. And then what is extra bad is if certain patient populations haven't been included in the trial, health technology assessment bodies, HTAs, and payers often use that to exclude these patients from the reimbursement scheme. So even if a regulator makes that extrapolation, you might be aware that regulators do that. So when an approval comes, they always think about what is the largest possible patient population that could benefit from this drug, while HTAs do the reverse and try to restrict as much as possible. So as a patient that then hits you the 3rd time, that it might not be reimbursed for your condition. And that's, of course, something for us that is serious to address. Officially, I call this the limited external validity of clinical trials. They're obsessed with internal validity, but if we don't pay attention how representative that trial population is to the real patient population, we will run into trouble. Design issues. I could be talking weeks about that, which I won't, but you have to be aware that design issues are serious. Inferior comparators are by definition unethical. The reason is you are not supposed to knowingly expose patients to it, knowingly to inferior treatment. This is if you've been brainwashed or if HTAs have tried to brainwash you, you will realize that this is exactly what HTAs demand. If you have a novel therapy that has considerable improvement over a standard of care, this is where we run into issues because HTAs want standard of care compared to the new one. How much more does it cost? How much better is it? And then calculate that. This is where we currently get stuck and where lots of patient advocates that I've seen haven't really figured out what is wrong with that argumentation. Because that sounds so nice, right? We take the standard of care, we compare with new. Well, if there are signs that the new is so much better than standard of care, that trial is unethical and we have to find another way. And the HTAs have to develop their methodology to be better at capturing benefit without killing our people on the trial. So that's a really, really thorny issue. Much love because it gives nice data. And that's then the big differences. If you see a huge difference in a phase 3 trial, I mean, clinicians get super excited about it at ASCO. And then the question is always either you started an unethical trial, so you knew that the difference was there from the phase 2, and you still started the phase 3, so this is an unethical behavior, or you were so stupid to not pick it up earlier on and were surprised by the large difference in a phase 3, in which case you were incompetent. So the decision, you can choose unethical or incompetent. And that's something that patient advocates often don't understand. So it is at that point, and if we don't put on the pressure, no one else will, because it's quite convenient for everyone else. Large effect size, it's called effect size, means you can run a quite small trial because you just don't need so many patients to show that there is this large type of effect, but it kills the people on the inferior treatment. Blinding, similar issue. I've been pushing for a long time that we should be demanding that we use placebos only in a scientifically validated fashion, so that there has to be evidence that there is a psychological effect on the desired endpoint. Usually cancer trials have OS, overall survival, or PFS, progression-free survival. I mean, I'm sure your patient forums are also full of positive attitudes. If that worked, our people would be champions and all survive. We know there is no proven evidence of any psychological factor improving overall survival. Quality of life, yes. Pain, yes. Depression, yes. There are demonstrated studies showing that a placebo has an effect. Overall survival, PFS, nada. So they basically quote a pain study in order to justify blinding in a cancer trial with hard endpoints. In reality, it's of course just to prevent patients from leaving the trial, which actually undermines that right to leave a trial without fear of repercussion. So it's basically the blinding is used to prevent patients from exerting their rights. And it's something, as you can tell, I don't agree with. Poor methodology is another one. If a trial is not sufficiently powered, too few patients to show a difference, sometimes hard to pick up, but we had a recent trial where we had a new treatment against therapy of like investigators' choice, where investigators could basically pick a treatment. Because the standards were so different between European countries, in the end, what it meant was that we had a data set where you had on one arm the new therapies, but compared against a whole basket of other therapies, which makes the data set weak. And no surprise, there was the problem. So you want to pick things up like that because it will undermine it will make it less likely that this trial will be successful or will be able to deliver meaningful results. Quality of life tools, I think, are a topic we can talk another week about. We have, depending on the disease, there are better or poorer tools. In melanoma, we are hopefully now getting a final one. The one we're currently having is totally meaningless, so whether use it or not has no impact. Translational strategy, that's something that I think lots of people miss. After a clinical trial is a fantastic opportunity to collect material for the next round of research, because you collect the clinical data of the patients on the trial in the end, what allows you to generate a really well annotated sample set with clinical data. That's why I always talk about problem spaces and understanding the entire context, because you should be thinking long term, not one trial at a time, but thinking what will the next trial be and what will the next trial be. If you have a good translational strategy early in place, you can accelerate the next step. So you can shorten the time and kind of the mental steps between trials. But for that, you need a well-designed translational strategy, and the samples have to be collected at relevant points. You would be surprised how sloppy trial designers are at that space. They either collect everything and then they want to poke a needle into a patient 3 times a day. And of course, I'm exaggerating, but just slightly. Or there's just no motivation for it at all, which is equally bad. So that's something I think for us as advocates to really look into it. Feasibility, another one. If the trial is not attractive, no one will join, which means the trial will not conclude. So also the patients who were on that were kind of wasted in the sense that it never contributed to learning. So you really want to think about, look at the trial, think, would you go on that trial, and then take it from there. If you wouldn't, then you probably shouldn't. This is a trial that shouldn't be running. That's of course just a wash list, but just like to give you a flavor where the issues are in order to get there. So level of involvement. I'm working on a large grant in Germany right now, and I drafted this for that. So this is just fresh. Thinking about the level of involvement. So there can be no involvement at all, and there can be essential involvement in the trial design. And I'm sure share the slide deck afterwards. But some of the involvement is purely cosmetic. That's like the informed consent. It doesn't matter whether it's Times New Roman or Arial, but it does not affect anything in the design or what the patient gets to see apart from that informed consent. Then there are more substantial ones where patients are, for example, on the steering committee, or where patients are already involved in the initiation of the trial. And of course, the impact increases with that. But this is something that I'm actually preparing for funders, for that very one, that they can say, we want to have at least substantial, if not essential, involvement of patients. And I think for us as community, something like this is valuable because we can distinguish and we can start grading involvement and make sure that we get less of no involvement at all or superficial involvement. Now, all of that needs a considerable level of knowledge. You can't do these things overnight, and it is not quite easy. I actually think that humor goes a long way in terms of both education, but also highlighting principles. So on the left, I've just talked about placebos. Placebo Christmas, everyone is chuckling in that, but it hits the point. We wouldn't do that to our kids, but patients we put on placebo. So just think about it. The other one was a Valentine I wrote 2 years ago on EQ5D, which is a quality of life tool, like a measure that we don't particularly like. So, you can poke fun at things, you can raise awareness. It doesn't always have to be so serious. I also think that these sometimes they really help because they make educational concepts sticky, like the handgun shooting in a cell dish. You can kill any cell in a dish, including with a handgun, but that doesn't mean that this is an appropriate approach for a patient. That's something that people often forget. They will share papers and then it's just a cell culture result, and they're not aware of the limitations of the experimental model for the real setting. And this one I think is also quite funny. We do a lot of training in how to read scientific papers, and I love this one. People often just read the abstract and you see the pizza carton where you think, oh, lots of salami. You open it and it doesn't look quite so nice. So, I think it's worth rethinking how we think about education. This is serious stuff. It has a lot of methodology. It can be quite dry. So it's worth, not to take ourselves so seriously and make it accessible for others and get people excited and engaged in the process. And I think, after this handgun, you will look at cell culture experiments differently. And after, you might even remember the salami pizza. So I think they are, in a way, though they are funny, they are in a way able to communicate complex concepts in a single image, and are in a way a shortcut to accelerate thinking and appropriate thinking in our community. As we're training people who are not scientifically trained, I believe these things are extremely important for us, actually, because they allow people without kind of like year-long training to catch up and to have access to something that is quite sophisticated. Because in the end, what we should never forget is who our audience is. Our audience are patients. We are there to make things better for patients. It's not to be involved somewhere. It's not to sit on the trial steering committee. And we should also not forget that trials that do not recruit get amended. If they're not listening to us, we have networks. That's why I said, put it on Twitter, say this trial is rubbish. I actually couldn't find it, but I actually made an official abbreviation for shitty. So, you know, everyone is an acronym. I couldn't find it. I was just like, it's somewhere on my Dropbox, which is just currently throwing a tantrum. But we should never forget, this is the last resort, and people will listen to you when they know that you're serious about it. So if an official intervention doesn't do anything about the trial is still rubbish, we will put it out. We will share it in our networks. It will go on Twitter, and then, well, we told them. You would be surprised how much attention and how much more seriously they take you the next time around. Sometimes they have to pay, and this is always a tell. You know, it's going to cost you a few million, but you know, it's your money. That's the way never to forget why we're in this. We're not in there because it's nice. We're there to make sure that our people survive. At least that's what I am in that. I realized that we're running a bit of time. I have some more slides I can share you if you're interested how we think about this problem space. We have developed a methodology how to look into problem spaces and how to analyze them. But this is like my second last slide is, in this space, you're only as good as your level of knowledge. The more you know, the more you can contribute, and people will seek you out. We have now people sending us their trial protocols and say, what do you think about it? Does that make sense? Is there anything we missed? So they're asked for honest advice, but that's just because we have all, and I see just my colleague Violetta is here on the call, we have all spent years working on that space, reading and educating ourselves, because our drive is to make things better, not just to criticize. So people come for advice. That means your knowledge is your value. That is what you contribute. So you should invest in it and you should take it seriously. Then you also know more than you think, because in the end, it's not just about one person. We're communities, and you can consider it as a disadvantage that our communities are heterogeneous. We all have different professional backgrounds, and people always say, oh, we're just patients. If you turn it around, you can also use it as an advantage. We have diverse backgrounds. We have people. We have anyone. We have people who work in data. We have people who work in data analysis. We have computer engineers. We have statisticians. We have medics. We have researchers in a huge variety. If we start leveraging that heterogeneity in knowledge and basically compose what I call like a knowledge architecture, really thinking about who can contribute what, we become unbeatable, because who else has that diversity in one group that shares a common goal, letting our people survive. So I think we have to kind of rethink how we look at our communities and how we train different people in different things, and then put it together to create something that no one else can compete on, basically. In the end, and well, as I said, we just have 1 hour here today. I believe it is not just what we know, but also how we think about our thinking and how we use our knowledge that makes a difference. Because we're limited by our own brain. If you start thinking, how can I complement what I know with someone else? How do I develop a strategy to think about my problem space? How do I develop solutions? We have used people who work in lean startups, for example, to teach us some of their tools. Thinking tools, support tools, allow you to reach a level of strategy and insight that just by looking at the problem, staring at the problem, you will never achieve. So it's not just the technical knowledge, it's also your structure, the structure in your thinking that in the end will define how far you can push it and how far you can go. I think, and this is like I'm coming to the end now, I do believe that this is actually one I made for this knowledge architecture. I try to always to draw things. I'm not very good. I don't like text. I think better in figures. And I'm thinking about, that basic research is an area we're interested in, clinical trials, regulatory HTA and policy. And we usually dip into these areas to address the problems in our community, which means we have a very good longitudinal view on our setting. But we will just know, I know best what is melanoma related. I already about the next solid tumor, I can't tell that much. But our communities dip into the same pools in different places. So that's what I meant with rethinking our architecture, how we hang together, how we can help each other will make a big difference in the end to how much we can move in this setting. So with that, I would like to thank you. I'm happy to take questions, and of course you can have the slides and all of that. And I'm happy to share, like, if you're interested another time, just like how we do. For example, we use Miro quite extensively, where we think that it helped us a lot to think about this what I call the problem space. Actually, I have it here. So I don't know whether you can see it here, but we basically did a pathway, a patient pathway, and mapped the problems on it, and then classified them in different categories. This is management, that would be the blue. The yellow one would be policy, the green is research. And then we use that to derive a strategy based on that. That's what I meant, the thinking. Put structure in your thinking is what makes you move. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thanks, Bettina. Absolutely fascinating presentation. And I think this is one that people are going to have to want to come back to every time you
Sure.
get involved in clinical trials, because there is so much to take in there, and it really is amazing. I'll jump in with a couple of quick questions. So the first one is access trials, and absolutely essential that patients are able to get access through clinical trials. One of the big questions here is different parts of the world. So how do you as an advocate argue for the creation of clinical trial sites in parts of the world where access may be more essential than other parts? And in particular, Rita has asked, how do you argue for trials to happen in the Nordics? And she's obviously coming from Denmark.
Well, actually, Denmark is a good example. I mean, Denmark had very few trials, and a few last years, Denmark is now the leading Nordic country when it comes to trials. Well, I guess I have a little bit of a pragmatic view on there. It's very easy to hate pharma and, have like these moral type of advocacies where we go should. I think a lot of it is like, I mean, we feel good about ourselves, but it never really moves things on the ground. In the end, companies will run trials there where it is cheap to run them, where they are fast to kick off, and where they think the drug will be used and approved afterwards. So you can tweak any of these factors. So a country where it's very unlikely that the drug will ever get approved, I think has a really, really bad starting point. So in that place, a policy on how to get innovation into these places would probably be the right place to start, because you have to get the motivation right to put the trial. The trial is not the issue. You can talk to them and they will never run a trial unless you fix the motivation on the other side. When it comes to the initiation of trials, it has a lot to do with administration and bureaucracy. So that would be a country that would be interesting, but it's just slow. Kick some politicians is probably a better way to go, because the incentives would be there. They're just not attractive because admin is so slow. And then it comes to, I think, the other way around, I think, especially for the Nordic countries, like, attractiveness. We're just all very small countries, but the Nordics together are 25 million people. Then something we have seen for rare diseases now for uveal melanoma is that the problem is, for example, that patients in Sweden are not streamlined. So we have about 80 patients diagnosed with uveal melanoma. 40 of them become metastatic, but they're not treated in the same center. So you never find these patients. In Belgium, they're in one big thing, in one big place. Who gets the trial, you think? So sometimes there is like how you can tweak the system. If you have a clear pathway that you find the patients somewhere, you make it more attractive, you make it easier to initiate the trial. So I think that's the way how to look at it. So there's no simple answer, but you have to really think, where's the issue, and be brutally honest about it. Because otherwise we just, we stand on our moral pedestal and, nothing's ever going to move.
I love that. I mean, people quite often talk about pragmatism and idealism as if they're totally competing things. But what I really like is your suggestion effectively it's pragmatic idealism. What are we actually really trying to do? What should things look like? But how do we practically get there, rather than just looking for this perfect world that's hypothetical and never really exists? So
it won't happen. So,
yeah. So the next question was around impact. So I guess really two parts to this. How do we measure the impact and the areas we're having an impact? Is there a metric we can do for this, or is it just have to be where do we think we actually are being listened to and making a difference?
Well, I think about trials. I spend a lot of time thinking about very, very early on, where do you move if you sit in a boat? I mean, I live in Sweden. We have a lot of water. If you've ever been rowing in a boat, if you try to row from the front, that's totally rubbish. You have no chance of really steering anything, and you'll be absolutely exhausted afterwards. So we spend a lot of time thinking about, if we want to change that, which is the spot where where do you have to be? And then you have to think, what does it take me to get to that place? And then if something is not working, you're of course looking at a chain of things, right? Did I get the spot wrong? Was I not prepared enough? So you really have to analyze and rethink your problem. So I don't think that a simple metric will fix it. And we've had lots of situations where people involved us quite late and we were like rather, just like, my God. But then kind of you did your homework for the next round because they thought it was valuable and they would come earlier the next round. And that's actually, I'm not sure whether Violetta would agree now because she's in here, we work a lot together. But I think the trend we're seeing is that our involvement is getting earlier and earlier and earlier. The longer we do it, people start to know us, they know what to expect from us, they know what we can contribute, and they come earlier and earlier. You can't start that way. If no one knows what you're about and even doesn't know you exist, expecting to be there at it is probably just not realistic. So that's why I'm thinking about these. That's why I call it problem spaces and solution spaces. And I think of these solution spaces as having multi-dimensions. So one has to be a timeline. What do I do today? What will it give me in terms of results tomorrow, at the end of the year, next year, in 10 years? What will it do across different geographies, different subgroups in our patient population? So, if I do something like this for stage 4, how will it affect the others? So I think it's about thinking also solutions in that space a bit more generous and a bit broader than just a single type of impact in a single conversation. I mean, I came up with that because, as I said, I really do this when I'm on a plane, usually home. I really think about, was this worth my time? And it's really difficult because, you see this single interaction and then you have to think about, and I often think back and things. I did it once that, just to give an example, I think that I thought was a total waste of my time. I just thought, oh my God, why did I ever sign up for that? And then I got, actually 2 years after, someone bumped into me at ASCO and said, well, you didn't see me, but it was, it was like broadcasted within the company. And it really, really got me to think. And I totally changed the way I'm working after that. And that got me then stuck, right? I mean, I thought I had totally wasted my time, and then absolutely unrelated, you get this and you go, So I call this as a bit, you need some risk capital. You have to just try a few things and just accept that some will work out and some will be rubbish, and that you might not always know which one was good and which one wasn't.
So kind of like a follow-up question to that. A researcher that's working on something really important for your patient community, if they don't want to listen to advocacy input, if they're just not open to the concept, what do you do? Do you push to be involved, even though you're not being listened to, or do you move on to a different area where someone wants to listen?
Oh, you can make everyone listen. At least we can, I mean, just like, so first, as I said, I don't care. I mean, just like I have this sense every meeting I don't have to be at is a good meeting. So, I try to live by that. So for me, it's not to be there in the room and then fight to be listened to. And also, I think advocates often get that wrong. We want to be listened to, and then they say, so tell us something, and then they're not prepared. I think you have to start with what you want first. So, I mean, you can challenge anyone on Twitter. If they publish something, you can publish. If I don't like a publication, I put a reply onto Nature. I'm not waiting it's like waiting for that birthday party invitation that never comes. I mean, we're in a we have to start. I mean, this is a scientific environment. Ben Goldacker actually said that science is not about white coats. It's about the methodology. So it's using that methodology to get your message across. If you're not happy with that research proposal, put it out. And yeah, of course you have to be professional. But it's not about complaining not to be involved. It's about finding the weakness in the research where you say, this research is missing the point because it fails to acknowledge that this is not the most suffering patient population, or we disagree with the design because. So you really have to cut through the chase. And what happens actually, oddly enough, is that at some point people tend to forget who you are. They want you for your insight. And it has happened for us in UM-Cure, actually, for uveal melanoma. I don't think they see us as patient advocates anymore. They send us the stuff because they want an opinion. And that's where you want to go. You want to be there because you know your stuff. And that's when things start moving.
And last question, because we're running out of time.
As always.
That's because there's so much to cover and so much to learn. Accessibility to a lay audience. I totally agree with your point of this is not just the responsibility of advocates to communicate it. This is part of the core science, is making sure your information is understandable to an audience. Again, What do you do with someone who doesn't want to do that, who doesn't see that as their responsibility? Do you communicate it anyway, or do you keep pushing back to them that that's their job? They need to make this accessible to the patient community.
So I think that's for us, it's a double, it's a double losing point, because often they outsource their job to the patient community and then have the guts to call it patient involvement. So we lose twice. So we do someone else's bloody job and don't get to do the real stuff. That's the type of stuff where we keep busy, unless you have a communication department and you have, unused capacity and you want to generate an income stream. You want to say you want to diversify the income of your patient organization, and you have a great comms team and they don't have enough work. And you say, well, we pay us and we do it. Then it's a service you provide and then you have a vested interest for it, right? That's fine by me. I don't care how you, I do care how you generate your income, but I think that's a valid reason. If this is you're supposed to do this in your free time, I'm thinking, don't you have something serious to do? And it's just undermining the whole purpose. I usually, in this kind of stuff, I usually go to the funders. It's like, everyone, you hurt cats by moving the footer. So you go to the funders. I'm not wasting my time on researchers in that setting. You go to the funders and say, And the funny thing about lay abstracts, there was the big why and everyone needed them. When the funders made them compulsory for the application, everyone is able to write them. So that's why you just have to make them compulsory. I think you could, the same thing. You can put it on Twitter, something like, I was wondering that funders could withhold 10% of the funding till we have the communication done for patients. Let's see what happens. You'd be surprised how much we have, it's this soft impact, this soft skill where I think we're not using this space most effectively. We can go to funders. I think that's the way to do it.
Well, absolutely brilliant. Unfortunately, we've run out of time because I have so many more questions that I want to ask, but I know everyone will probably have to run to other meetings, etc. If anyone joined partway through, this is being broadcast live on Alan's Facebook channel as well. So the recording will remain there. Feel free to share with any other advocates or anyone else you think, particularly maybe other researchers you think should listen to Bettina giving a very frank insight into clinical trials and how we make sure that they get the most meaningful impact for patients. Absolutely fascinating. So feel free to share far and wide. Thanks so much, Bettina, for giving up your time. Know how busy you are. Really, really useful. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Bye, everyone.
Be safe, everyone. See you soon. Bye.